Good evening from Washington, D.C. I'm Mehdi Hassan in for Chris Hayes. Nearly 7 years ago, Donald Trump entered the race for president. He came down that gold escalator at Trump Tower and proceeded to defeat 16 eminently qualified candidates, including senators, governors, and even the brother and son of a president. He beat them all and took over the Republican Party. And then his presidency was a total car crash. He led Republicans to defeat in the House in 2018 and then lost the Senate and the presidency in 2020, making him the first president to lose all three in a single term since Herbert Hoover in 1932. Now, you would think that after all of that, the Republican Party would want to rid itself of Donald J. Trump, that they would want to kick him out into the wilderness and move on. But they have not moved on, and the ex-president has an even more iron grip on the party than before. He may even have more power over the Republican Party today sitting in exile in Mar-a-Lago than he did while in the Oval Office. In a new piece for the New York Times, Shane Goldmacher describes it as the Mar-a-Lago machine and Trump as a modern-day party boss. Quote, inspiring fear, hoarding cash, doling out favors, and seeking to crush rivals, Mr. Trump is behaving not merely as a power broker, but as something closer to the head of a 19th century political machine. A former Trump advisor describes the ex-president's exile at his South Florida resort as, quote, a developing Tammany situation, referring, of course, to Tammany Hall, the political machine that essentially controlled New York City for nearly 200 years. Goldmacher also compares Trump to Tammany Hall's most notorious, deeply corrupt leader, Boss Tweed, shown in this famous cartoon, saying, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? That certainly sounds familiar. You'll remember when Donald Trump asked Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to just find him 11,780 votes to overturn Joe Biden's win in that crucial state. Of course, Raffensperger thankfully refused, and so Trump has since endorsed his challenger, along with many other far-right Secretary of State candidates around the country who plan on doing his bidding come 2024, who plan on counting the votes for him. He is, as Shane Goldmacher puts it, quote, aggressively pursuing an agenda of vengeance against Republicans who have wronged him, endorsing more than 140 candidates nationwide and turning the 2022 primaries into a stress test of his continued sway. For example, last week, Trump issued this anti-endorsement telling Pennsylvanians to not vote for Republican Bill McSwain for governor. That is in retaliation for McSwain, as Trump says, doing absolutely nothing as then U.S. Attorney General on the massive election fraud that took place in Philadelphia and throughout the Commonwealth. Of course, there was no massive fraud. But perhaps the best demonstration of Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago machine comes from the parade of Republicans who make the pilgrimage to Palm Beach to kiss their leader's ring and beg him for assistance. Goldmacher paints the picture, quote, working from a large wooden desk reminiscent of the one he used in the Oval Office, Trump has transformed Mar-a-Lago's old bridal suite into a shadow GOP headquarters. And the ex-president has amassed more than $120 million, a war chest more than double that of the Republican National Committee itself, which he doles out stingily to candidates seeking his approval. Some of those candidates even pay to attend Mar-a-Lago fundraisers. For others, clamoring for a fleeting moment of Mr. Trump's attention, or better yet, a photo. One North Carolina candidate for Congress posted this video of her opportunity to step up to Trump's makeshift Mar-a-Lago stage and snap a picture. She called it, quote, an epic moment. The candidates often play to the ex-president's ego. Surprise. Of course, Trump enjoys flattery and is not above rewarding sycophants, and they try to feed him information just the way he likes it. Insiders say bringing compelling visual material matters. Big fonts are crucial. I do not know whether to laugh or cry. Some have used Trump's favorite medium, television, even running ads far away from their voters, in an attempt to catch his eye. Michelle Fiore, a Las Vegas city councilwoman, announced her candidacy for governor of Nevada in this ad that aired over 2,000 miles away in West Palm Beach, Florida.
I spent my whole life fighting the establishment. I was the first female majority leader in the Nevada Assembly and one of the first electeds to endorse Donald J. Trump. And you better believe I was attacked for it. Washington Post called me a gun-toting calendar girl. And Politico magazine said I was the Lady Trump. And I don't care.
And apparently she did get Trump's attention. Last month, she changed her mind and moved down to the race for state treasurer, saying in another ad that she made the decision after talking to the ex-president's team. So, while it seems fair to compare Donald Trump to Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall or even former President Richard Nixon, there is an important difference. Those figures, for all their corruption, were accomplished political operators in their own right. Donald Trump is clearly not. He should not be where he is, still leading the Republican Party after bringing them to a crushing defeat. And that tells you as much about that party as it does about Trump. Shane Goldmacher is a national political reporter with the New York Times. He profiled Trump's party boss turn in that latest piece of his, which is a must-read, and he joins me now. Shane, thanks so much for coming on the show this evening. I want to talk about some of the stuff you revealed, but first I've got to ask, what is the atmosphere like in a place like Mar-a-Lago? What kind of people show up there, aside from the candidates looking for attention?
Look, it's developed its own political economy, its own political gravity. You have Republican candidates from across the country coming to seek meetings with him. And if they don't have a meeting, to go to fundraisers for others to try to, again, get that chance at a photo. That clip you showed of the candidate from North Carolina getting her moment. There were at least 3 other candidates from 3 other states that same night who posted pictures or had a moment with Trump or said that they were there. You've got donors from across the country who are coming, who have homes in Palm Beach area, or just are trying to, stay in touch with the president. You have political operatives. Very much the center of the Republican Party's power right now is in South Florida. Again, despite the fact that Trump is out of the White House and that he lost power in 2020, despite his efforts to say otherwise.
Shane, as with every member of the Trump family, you have to ask, follow the money, and where's the money going? Do we know where the money in Trump's coffers is going? You report that he's double the money of the RNC, and yet he's quite stingy with it. Quote, for many, his support goes no further than an email and a $5,000 check.
Yeah, so far he hasn't spent much of the money. He raised a lot of this money in the aftermath of the 2020 election, telling his supporters that there was fraud and he needed this money to fight the fraud. But he banked much of their money for his future endeavors and didn't spend it on those legal fights that he mostly lost after 2020. So he's sitting on this huge war chest and heading into the 2022 midterms. Now, he's endorsed, as you said, more than 140 candidates across the country, and he is beginning to spend a little bit more. He's investing in the Georgia governor's race upcoming, where his preferred handpicked candidate is behind in the polls and running against one of the sort of top people on that vengeance agenda that I described, Governor Brian Kemp, who certified the 2020 election, despite much opposition from Trump. And Trump has been after him ever since. And so that's a race where he's going to dip in a little bit to the money. But again, mostly this money is going to fund his future political endeavors. And for Trump, having the money is power. One of the power he has is not just his popularity among Republican voters. It's that the party that is raising money, when he's doubling the money of the party itself, when they send out their fundraising emails, they're sending it out with his name. His name is the one raising so much of the money for Republicans.
So, Shane, how is the tension between Trump and Republican Party leaders in D.C. in particular playing out? You report that Trump's enduring popularity with the base frightened some of them, like House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who has, quote, tried to keep Trump on the sidelines in some primaries. This, of course, is the same McCarthy who made a pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago to take a photo with Trump after 1-6. Yeah,
the relationship between McCarthy and Trump is fairly different than McConnell and Trump, the Senate Republican leader. McConnell has broken with Trump pretty clearly, and Trump is out there attacking McConnell publicly and by name. McCarthy has kept Trump closer, and one of the reasons is that he doesn't have the same iron grip on his own conference that McConnell does. So presuming the Republicans can win the majority this fall, which history says they have a big advantage to do, Kevin McCarthy needs to keep almost all the Republican votes to become the next speaker. And to do that, he's going to need some pro-Trump Republicans who might not necessarily be pro-Kevin McCarthy Republicans. And so he's kept the former president pretty close. Again, he visited multiple times. He's tried to keep him out of races where maybe an anti-McCarthy kind of Republican would be entering the House. But look, they try to do the best they can. Trump brings an enormous energy for the base of the Republican Party, but he continues in private polls and private focus groups to turn off the kind of election deciding mid-tier voters. Swing voters are turned off by Trump still. And that's one of the hopes that Democrats have in 2022 is that, look, things may not be going well for the Democratic Party. Can they scare some Democrats into thinking Trump and Trump Republicans could be coming back into power?